Somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, a wolf stopped running. It paused at the edge of a human campfire, stood in the cold dark, and made a choice that changed both species forever. Tonight, that story ends at the foot of your bed. The fire is small. It burns in a landscape that most humans today would not recognize as livable. A vast wind-stripped plain across what will one day become Europe or Central Asia, under a sky so cold that the stars look sharper than glass. The last glacial maximum has been pressing its weight against the northern hemisphere for thousands of years. The ice is at its furthest reach, the temperatures lower than anything in recorded human experience. The land stripped bare by wind that has no obstacles left to work around. The world is quieter than anything you have ever heard. And somewhere in the middle of that cold and quiet, a small group of people has built a fire and is sitting beside it. They are not farmers. There are no farms yet, and will not be for at least another 10,000 years. These are hunters and gatherers, people who carry everything they own and follow the movement of animals across the land. They eat what they find. They sleep where shelter allows. Tonight, the shelter is a shallow overhang of rock, and the fire is throwing its light out against the dark. And just beyond that circle of warmth, something is watching. The wolf standing at the edge of the firelight is not the grey wolf you might picture. Genetic studies have established that the animal which eventually became the dog was descended from an extinct wolf population, one that no longer exists in any form on Earth today. The grey wolves, still alive in forests and mountains and Arctic territories, are cousins, not ancestors. The true ancestor is gone, preserved only in ancient bones surfacing from frozen ground and in the DNA of every dog that has ever lived. The creature watching the fire tonight comes from a lineage that will, in one direction, eventually vanish entirely, and in another, become something the world has never seen before. Scientists estimate that the genetic divergence between the dog's ancestor and the wolves still alive today began somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, placing the very start of this story squarely inside the last ice age. This is not a world of villages or stored grain. The people at this fire have no permanent address. Their children will not have permanent addresses, not for many thousands of years to come. And yet the dog is already here, already beginning, already holding still at the edge of human light, before any of that rooted, settled life had come into existence at all. This is what makes the dog unlike every other animal that humans have ever domesticated. Sheep, cattle, horses, pigs, all of these came later, all of them shaped by a world that had already learned how to grow food and raise walls and stay in one place. Dogs came before any of that. Dogs are older than the farm, older than the city, older than writing of any kind. They were already watching human fires when all of those things were still thousands of years in the future. They are, to this day, the first and the only large carnivore that humans have ever successfully domesticated anywhere on Earth. There is something worth pausing over in that. The domestication of the dog is not a small footnote in human history. It is one of the oldest verifiable things we know about ourselves as a species. Evidence that even in the hardest and coldest and most uncertain conditions humans have ever endured, something in us was willing to extend a kind of trust across a boundary that had never been crossed before. An animal that could kill was allowed to come closer. A fire that could have been defended was left open. And slowly, across generations neither side could count or comprehend, something changed. If you are settled in for the night, letting the dark and the quiet do their work around you, then you are already part of this story. The 20 chapters ahead move gently through everything that happened between that frozen campfire and this moment. If this channel has found you on a night when you needed something calm and true to carry you through, stay with us. We will be here through all of it. The wolf at the edge of the fire is still watching. It has not moved closer yet. It has not run. And that single suspended moment, a wild creature holding perfectly still in the presence of something unfamiliar, is where every part of what follows was born. The domestication of the dog did not begin with a human choice. There was no evening on which someone looked at a wolf and decided to build something new from it. The beginning was inside the wolf population itself, in a variation that already existed long before any intentional relationship was possible. In any wild population, individuals vary in how they respond to perceived threats. Some animals are highly reactive, turning and fleeing at the earliest sign of something unfamiliar. Others carry what researchers call a lower flight response, a wider tolerance for proximity to other species before the instinct to run takes over. In the wolf populations living across Eurasia tens of thousands of years ago, this variation was real and consequential. The wolves at the lower end of the fear range, those with a slightly higher tolerance for the presence of humans nearby, were positioned to access something that the more fearful wolves could not reach. Human camps left food behind, not food offered deliberately, not any gesture of goodwill, just the ordinary debris of survival, discarded bones, scraps of butchered animals, the accumulated waste of a group of people eating their way through the rich hunting grounds of the last ice age. For a wolf willing to approach close enough, once the fire was low and the camp was quiet, this was a reliable and relatively low-effort food source. In the arithmetic of surviving a glacial climate, where every calorie has weight and every expenditure of energy carries a cost, that advantage was not trivial. An animal that could eat without running a full hunt had more energy left for staying warm, for raising its young, for surviving the lean months that claimed less fortunate wolves. The result, accumulating slowly across many generations, was a gradual shift in the wolf population nearest the human camps. The animals that could tolerate proximity tended to eat better, survive more reliably, and reproduce more successfully. Their offspring inherited some portion of that lowered fearfulness, and their offspring did the same. No human was directing any of this. No selection was being consciously applied. The fires simply kept burning. The scraps kept appearing at the margins of human life, and the wolves that could draw close kept doing better than the ones that could not. Scientists sometimes call this self-domestication, and the term carries a specific implication worth pausing on. The first movement in this story was made by the wolves, not by the people. The animals selected themselves into closer proximity to human life through the perfectly ordinary mechanism of survival advantage. It was not dramatic. It did not unfold in a single generation, or in 10, or in 50. It happened across far more generations than any individual life could contain, a slow statistical bending of a population toward a new way of living, invisible from inside any single lifetime. Humans were not entirely passive in this process, though they were not directing it. A group of people who regularly saw wolves appearing near their camp would have responded. The ones that came too close, showed aggression, or threatened food stores or children would have been driven off. The ones that held a tolerable distance, that moved quietly at the edges without disrupting anything, might have been left alone. Some may have been watched with a kind of wary, growing familiarity. That tolerance, granted or withdrawn based on each animal's behavior, was itself shaping the population at the fire's edge, however unintentionally. Neither species understood what they were doing. The wolves were surviving, the humans were managing a border, but the combined effect of those two things, played out across thousands of generations, was the beginning of the only relationship between two large predatory species that has ever produced something that looks, unmistakably, like companionship. The wolves that fled are gone now, or remain what they always were. The wolves that stayed became something the world had never seen. produced not by any single decision, but by the accumulated weight of millions of small survivals, each one tilting a population a fraction further in a new direction. Dogs are not tamed wolves in the way a kept animal is tamed. Taming changes an individual during its own lifetime. What happened here changed a lineage across geological time, and what emerged at the end of it was physiologically and behaviorally distinct from any wolf alive, shaped by pressures no one planned and no one observed in their entirety. There is something quietly remarkable in that. The relationship was not invented by anyone. It grew, the way anything with deep roots grows, slowly and without a witness to the whole of it, out of the ordinary conditions of survival, repeated over a stretch of time most minds resist trying to fully imagine. What those wolves found when they finally stayed close enough to matter is what the next part of this story is made of. It begins with the most basic facts of cold and hunger, and with two species learning, without meaning to, what the other was able to offer. The exchange worked because it served both sides. On the wolf side, the benefit was tangible and immediate. Reliable food with less energy spent hunting. Warmth in a climate where warmth was survival. A degree of safety in numbers that a solitary animal rarely experiences. These are not small advantages when you are trying to stay alive through the coldest period the Northern Hemisphere had seen in tens of thousands of years. The wolves that tolerated proximity to human camps were, by any measurable standard, better positioned to survive than those that did not. What the humans were gaining is the more interesting half of the story, and it is something they would not have been able to articulate. A wolf living at the margin of a camp is, simply by being a wolf, an early warning system. Wolves are extraordinarily sensitive to their environment. They can detect sounds from roughly 4 times the distance a human can hear them. They can process frequencies far above what human ears can register at all. Their sensitivity to scent gives them information about the surrounding landscape that no human nose is equipped to gather. When something moved in the dark outside the firelight, something the sleeping hunters could not yet hear, the wolf at the edge already knew. It did not know in any form that translated into a useful message. The wolf did not understand that there were people nearby who would benefit from a warning. But it responded, as wolves respond to anything that registers as significant in their sensory world, with a visible change, a raised head, a shift in posture, a low sound that meant nothing specific but communicated alertness, and a group of light sleeping hunter-gatherers, for whom unexpected disturbances in the night meant real and immediate danger, would have woken at that change and been alert for the threat before it arrived. Over many generations, the human groups that kept wolves nearby may have fared better than those that did not. Not because the wolves were choosing to help them, but because the basic facts of wolf biology created a side effect that was genuinely useful to the people sharing the space. One species benefited without the other species intending to provide the benefit. This kind of indirect arrangement is not unusual in nature, but few examples of it have produced consequences as significant as this one. The warmth was real and persistent in its own right. A wolf's body temperature runs slightly higher than a human's, and sleeping near a large, warm animal in a landscape where temperatures could drop far below what the human body tolerates without help was not a comfort, it was a survival strategy. The phrase commonly expressed across many cultures as something like 3-dog night, meaning a night so cold it takes 3 dogs to stay warm, is not a metaphor with a modern origin. It was, at its original use, a practical calculation made by people who knew from long experience that the bodies of the animals they lived near were part of what kept them alive through the worst nights. Something else was also beginning to happen inside this arrangement, something that would only reveal its significance much later. Animals that live close to other species over long periods of time, and that survive better by doing so, tend to pay increasing attention to the behavior of their neighbors. A wolf that could read human body language, that learned to recognize patterns in how the people around it distributed food or signaled danger, had a subtle but real advantage over wolves that could not. That growing attentiveness to human behavior, repeated across generations, was the quiet beginning of something that would eventually become one of the most studied phenomena in the science of animal cognition. But at this point in the story, it was still just survival. One animal watching another with slightly more focused interest than before. The relationship was not yet affection. It was not partnership in any intentional sense. It was proximity, mutual advantage, and the gradual accumulation of shared experience across enough generations that it began to change the animals involved in ways that went deeper than behavior. The wolves nearest the fire were beginning to look different. They were beginning to move differently. They were beginning to respond to the presence of humans in ways that other wolves did not. And the humans were beginning, slowly and without conscious awareness of the process, to feel something different in their presence as well. Familiarity, built one night at a time over many thousands of years, does not stay neutral indefinitely. It shifts. It becomes something harder to name and harder to undo. It becomes, eventually, part of the baseline of what feels like safety, part of what feels like ordinary life, part of what feels, after enough time has passed, like belonging. The wolves were coming closer, and the humans were beginning, in the way that only long repetition can produce, to let them. The wolves that came closer were also, slowly, changing in how they looked. This is one of the more surprising findings to emerge from the study of domestication, and it runs counter to the assumption that behavior and appearance are independent of each other. They are not. When an animal is selected, even unconsciously, for calmer, more tolerant behavior around other species, the physical characteristics of that animal tend to shift as well. The same genetic pathways that regulate stress responses and fearfulness also influence the development of other traits, including the shape of the face, the size of the ears, the texture of the coat, and the proportions of the body. Change one, and the others follow. In the wolves that were gradually spending more time near human camps, the generational accumulation of lower stress behavioral tendencies began to produce animals that looked subtly different from their wilder cousins. Shorter, blunter snouts, rounder faces, smaller overall body size in some lines. Ears that, in certain individuals, had a softer set to them than the rigid, upright ears of a hunting wolf. These were not intentional breeding results. They were the physical signatures of a population that had been, generation after generation, living closer to humans and under somewhat lower levels of chronic stress than the wolves that remained fully wild. The most precise modern illustration of this process comes from a long-running scientific experiment in Novosibirsk, Russia. In 1959, a geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev began selectively breeding silver foxes, choosing only the tamest individuals in each generation for reproduction. The goal was to understand the biological basis of domestication, and what he found was startling. Within a surprisingly small number of generations, breeding purely for behavioral tameness produced foxes that wagged their tails, sought human contact, and responded to people with the kind of social engagement more commonly associated with dogs. But the behavioral changes were not the only thing that appeared. The foxes also began to develop floppy ears, shorter, more rounded muzzles, spotted and patchy coat patterns, unlike those of wild foxes, curled tails. Physical changes that no one had selected for, appearing as a byproduct of selecting for something else entirely. Belyaev's experiment, which continued for decades after his death and is still ongoing, demonstrated that the physical appearance researchers associate with domesticated animals and with juvenile versions of wild ones are not separate from the behavioral shifts of domestication. They are expressions of the same underlying biological process. The same developmental systems that moderate fear responses also regulate how fully certain physical features develop. An animal selected for reduced fearfulness is, almost automatically, also being selected for a more juvenile-looking face. This matters for the story of dogs, because it tells us that the animals emerging from tens of thousands of years of living near human camps were not simply tamer wolves in wolf bodies. They were becoming physically different, developing faces and proportions that humans, with our deep-seated responses to infant-like features, would have found less threatening and more approachable. Rounded faces and large eyes and soft expressions trigger protective instincts in humans. They are the features that make us feel, often before we consciously recognize it, that something is safe to approach and worth caring for. The emerging proto-dogs were, whether by accident or by the deep logic of coevolution, wearing faces that were easier for humans to feel warmly about. The change was generational and invisible from inside any single lifetime. A hunter alive in this period would not have seen the transformation happening. They would simply have noticed that the wolves nearest the camp looked and behaved somewhat differently from the wolves farther out, and that the ones closest were, in some quality that was hard to name, easier to be near, easier to watch, easier to reach toward, if you were the kind of person who found yourself wanting to. What was disappearing, degree by almost imperceptible degree, was the quality in the original wolves that had made them unambiguously wild, that sharp, fully armored quality of an animal that has never needed anything from your direction. The animals at the edge of the fire were losing that quality. They were becoming, in its place, something that fit more comfortably into the space between wild and not wild, a space that had not existed before and that had been created, jointly and without intention, by two species spending a very long time in each other's proximity. The animal that was emerging did not yet have a name, but it was beginning to have a face that the people at the fire recognized, however dimly and without words for it, as something they wanted to keep seeing. The next step would bring it fully inside the circle of the light, and the story of how that happened is one that begins not with an adult animal making a calculated approach, but with something much smaller, much younger, and much harder for any human to walk away from. At some point, someone brought a pup inside the circle of the fire. No one recorded when this happened or where, and the archaeological record cannot give us the moment with any precision. But researchers who study the history of domestication believe that at some stage in the long process of wolves and humans growing accustomed to each other, humans began to actively take wolf pups in and raise them. This is not an unusual behavior in the context of human history. Across many cultures and many parts of the world, people have raised young wild animals, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of practical interest in what they might eventually offer, and sometimes, perhaps most often, simply because a young animal is difficult to leave behind when you find it. A wolf pup is small and soft and helpless in ways that larger adult wolves never are. The same instinct that makes humans responsive to the needs of human infants, the biological draw towards something small and vulnerable and dependent, extends across species far more readily than we tend to assume. People who encounter young animals in distress very frequently want to help them. This impulse appears in every human culture with a record and in individuals regardless of their relationship with wild animals in any other context. It is old and it is strong, and in the setting of a Paleolithic camp, it almost certainly expressed itself regularly in the form of wolf pups being carried back and kept. What happened to those pups matters for understanding why domestication worked the way it did. A wolf pup raised from birth by humans, fed by them, handled by them, kept in their company during the critical early weeks when behavioral patterns are forming, will grow into an adult wolf that is tolerant of human presence in a way that wild raised wolves are not. This is a real and meaningful difference, but it does not make that animal a dog. A hand-raised wolf is still a wolf. It retains the full behavioral repertoire of its species, including the independence, the difficulty with direction, the social structures that do not map onto human expectations, and the adult flight response that can reassert itself even in an animal that has known humans its entire life. The transformation from wolf to dog was not something that happened in any single animal's lifetime. No individual pup, however well raised and however warmly bonded to its human family, crossed the entire distance from wolf to dog in one generation. What changed was which animals were selected to reproduce. When a camp raises wolf pups and keeps some as they grow, and over time gives the calmest and most engaged ones preferential access to food and shelter and the chance to produce offspring, the population of animals associated with that camp shifts across generations. Each generation of pups is born from parents that were slightly more tolerant, slightly more responsive, slightly more attuned to human signals than the average wolf. And over enough generations, that accumulation of small differences produces an animal that is genuinely different from where it started. The selection driving this was almost entirely unconscious. The people doing it were not thinking about genetics or behavioral inheritance or the long-term shape of a lineage. They were making individual daily decisions. This one is pleasant to have around. That one is too aggressive. This pup from the latest litter is the easiest to handle. But those daily decisions, repeated across enough human generations and enough wolf generations, had the cumulative effect of a breeding program conducted without awareness that any such program was underway. There is something almost tender in this mechanism, once you see it for what it is. No grand plan, no vision of what the result would eventually become. Just people, generation after generation, keeping the animals they liked best, and the animals that caused them the least trouble, without knowing that they were, in doing so, slowly building something that would outlast every other human creation of that era, and most of every era since. The pup by the fire grew up. It had pups of its own. Some of those were kept too, and at a scale and over a time frame that no individual human participant could ever have perceived. The animal that spent its nights sleeping near people began to carry, in its genes and in its behavior, the marks of having been shaped by that proximity in ways that went all the way down. That animal was becoming the first dog. It had not yet been anywhere near Bonn Oberkassel, Germany, but the night was coming when one of its descendants would be laid into the earth there with more care than most of the world's animals ever receive. And what that burial reveals is the part of this story worth settling into most slowly. There is a place where this story touches solid ground, where the long arc of shared history between humans and dogs stops being inference and becomes something you can hold in your hands. In 1914, workers quarrying stone in the Oberkassel district of Bonn, Germany, cut through a layer of rock and found bones. Human bones, and with them the bones of a dog, and alongside all of them, objects made of bone and antler worked into shapes that only hands with careful intent could have made. The discovery was significant enough to be studied extensively, and in the decades since, modern forensic and genetic analysis has given the site its full story. The burial contained the remains of two people, a man estimated to have been in his 40s, and a woman estimated to have been in her mid-20s, laid to rest together with grave goods, including artworks, and covered with red hematite pigment applied to the bones, a burial practice found at other sites across this period and believed to carry ritual or symbolic significance. The unified nature of the burial, all the remains in a single layer over a small area, with both humans and the dog covered together, has led researchers to conclude that the three were buried at the same time, as a single event, not accumulated gradually over years. The dog was young, Analysis of the bones places the animal at approximately 7.5 months of age at death, slightly under 50 centimeters at the shoulder, and weighing somewhere between 13 and 18 kilograms. In build, the animal would have looked broadly similar to a slender modern sighthound or a border collie, lean and relatively long-legged for its size. The remains date to approximately 14,223 years ago, making this burial the oldest confirmed instance of a dog being interred alongside humans anywhere in the archaeological record. The grave goods tell us something important about the people involved. They were not purely survival-focused in the way that a purely subsistence-driven reading of Paleolithic life might suggest. They made objects that served no instrumental purpose, things shaped for their form, worked with skill and patience. They had aesthetic lives. They valued things beyond the immediately practical. And into this context, into a burial that also contained the fruits of their artistry and the remains of two human beings laid out with apparent care, they placed the body of a dog, not the body of a tool, not the carcass of an animal kept for its labor. A young dog, buried with the same markers of significance that accompanied the people beside it, in a grave that was sealed and covered and left, as far as archaeologists can determine, undisturbed for more than 14,000 years, until those quarry workers, in 1914, broke through the stone above it. The weight of that is worth sitting with for a moment. 14,000 years is a span of time that resists easy imagination. The Egyptian pyramids are roughly 4,500 years old. The oldest writing that has survived is approximately 5,000 years old. The burial at Bon Oberkassel predates all of that by almost 3 times. The people who laid that dog in the earth had no writing, no cities, no agriculture, no pottery. They lived in small groups, following the movements of game, across a landscape that is now covered in roads and buildings and the accumulated material of 10,000 years of civilization. And in that life, they had a dog that they buried as if it mattered. It mattered. Whatever the specific nature of that relationship, whatever words those people would have used for it if they had had words for it at all, the act of burial is not a neutral one. Burial with grave goods and with deliberate covering is not what you do with something that was merely useful. It is what you do with something that was valued, something whose absence required a formal acknowledgement. The man and the woman buried at Bon Oberkassel had a dog, and when the dog died, they buried it with them, or someone buried all 3 together, with the objects that had meaning in their lives, and with the red pigment that marked the passage of something worth marking. They did this 14,223 years ago. The gesture is completely legible from where we stand. No translation is required. Across all the distance of time between them and us, the meaning of burying a young dog alongside the people it belonged to is something that any person living today, in any culture, could recognize immediately for what it is. But the story the bones of that dog carry goes even further than the burial itself, and the part that researchers uncovered in a 2018 re-examination of the remains is, in some ways, the most quietly remarkable piece of evidence in this entire long history. Researchers examined those bones again in 2018. The re-examination, led by a team including researchers from the University of Antwerp and the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, used modern analytical methods to look more closely at what the original discovery in 1914 had not been able to reveal. What they found was not simply confirmation of the burial's age or the animal's species. It was evidence of something that changed the interpretation of the entire site. The dog's bones showed clear signs of severe, repeated illness. The specific pattern of lesions, recorded in the oral cavity and reflected in the condition of the remaining skeletal material, pointed to a morbillivirus infection, most likely canine distemper. This is a disease that humans still encounter in dogs today, one that causes fever, severe lethargy, loss of appetite, neurological symptoms including seizures and involuntary muscle movements, and, in untreated animals, frequently death. In the disease's acute phases, an affected animal becomes essentially helpless, unable to regulate its own temperature, unable to forage, unable to function independently. The evidence in the Bonn Oberkassel dog's bones pointed to 3 separate bouts of this illness across a period of approximately 6 weeks, all of them occurring when the animal was between roughly 19 and 23 weeks of age, well before its death at around 27 to 28 weeks. 3 cycles of severe illness across 6 weeks. 3 periods during which the animal would have been close to dying, incapable of helping itself, completely dependent on whatever was around it. For the dog to have survived those 3 bouts long enough to die naturally at 7.5 months, it would have had to be kept warm during the periods when its body could not regulate its own temperature. It would have had to be fed during the periods when it could not seek food. It would have had to be watched, attended to, protected from the ordinary risks of a Paleolithic environment that would have ended any vulnerable animal very quickly if left unattended. The conclusion the researchers reached was direct. The dog could not have survived this illness without active human care. Its survival was not a matter of luck or resilience. It required the sustained attention of the people around it. This is not a small finding. Before this re-examination, the dominant theoretical framework for understanding early dog domestication centered on utility. Dogs were kept because they were useful, because they helped with hunting, provided warmth, served as a food source in times of scarcity, or offered protection. The Bonn Oberkassel evidence sits outside that framework entirely. A sick puppy that cannot hunt, cannot guard, cannot warm anyone, that requires active resources to keep alive during weeks of helplessness, offers no utility. The only reason to care for it is because you want it to live. The researchers who published their findings in 2018 noted that the burial, combined with the evidence of the illness and the care required for the dog's survival, suggested that the relationship between these people and this animal was not instrumental, it was emotional. The phrase used in commentary on the findings was simple and direct. Ancient humans loved their dogs, not managed them, not used them, loved them. And when the young dog they had nursed through 3 rounds of near-fatal illness finally died, they buried it alongside themselves, covered it with the same pigment that marked their own dead, and placed it in the same ground as the man and the woman it had belonged to. 14,000 years separate that burial from this night, and none of the distance changes what the act means. The same impulse that moved those people to keep that sick puppy alive through 6 weeks of illness, to feed it and warm it and stay with it through the nights when it was closest to dying, is the same impulse that makes a person today sit on the floor of a veterinary office and refuse to leave while their dog is being treated. The names for it are different. The circumstances are different. The biology behind it is exactly the same. The care those people gave that dog was not a footnote in their survival. It was a cost. It took time and resources and attention that could have gone elsewhere. They gave it anyway, because the animal mattered to them in a way that defied any purely practical accounting. That is what the bones at Bonn Oberkassel are keeping. That is what they held in the cold earth of the Rhine Valley for 14,000 years, waiting to be read. And that emotional truth, confirmed now in the record of a young animal's bones, rather than in any document or word anyone ever wrote down, tells us something important about the whole story we have been tracing through these chapters. The bond between humans and dogs was not built only on mutual survival advantage. It was built on care, freely given to an animal that could not return it in kind, by people who gave it anyway, because the animal had become, in some way that the evidence now makes undeniable, one of their own. The burial at Bonn Oberkassel tells us something beyond the story of one dog and 2 people. It places the fully formed human-dog relationship at a date that, for most people, comes as a genuine surprise. The assumption built into many popular accounts of early human history is that domestication of animals was something that came with agriculture. The story is told, often, in a particular sequence. Humans settle down, begin farming, and in that context of permanent settlements and stored food, begin to domesticate the animals around them. Sheep, cattle, goats, pigs, all of these fit that story reasonably well. Their domestication does cluster around the period when human societies were becoming agricultural, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in different parts of the world. Dogs do not fit this story. They break it. The burial at Bonn Oberkassel is 14,223 years old. Agriculture in the region where that burial occurred was still several thousand years in the future. The people who buried that dog were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They had no fields, no stored grain, no permanent settlements, no livestock in any other form. The relationship they had with that dog existed entirely outside the agricultural context that supposedly created domestication. It predates that context by thousands of years, and Bonn Oberkassel is not even the beginning of dog domestication. It is simply the oldest well-preserved burial. The genetic and archaeological evidence for the divergence of dogs from their wolf ancestor extends much further back, into a period when permanent human settlement was not merely absent, but inconceivable given the climate and the way people were living. Dogs were domesticated while humans were still fully nomadic, still following game across a landscape that offered no fixed address, still living entirely from what they could hunt and gather from one day to the next. This makes dogs the only animal that humans domesticated before they themselves had permanent homes. Sit with that for a moment. The dog came first, before the first farm, before the first village, before the first city wall or granary or kiln. Humans and dogs had already built their relationship across thousands of years of shared nomadic life, before any of the structures that define human civilization came into existence. The dog did not emerge from civilization. In some sense, it traveled towards civilization alongside the humans who were building it, already present, already bonded, already part of the social fabric of human life, long before any of the artifacts we associate with human advancement had appeared. The bond between humans and dogs is older than bread. It is older than pottery. It is older than the wheel. It is older than every written language and every city and every permanent settlement of any kind anywhere on earth. The dog was there before all of it, and it was there because the relationship had already proven itself across tens of thousands of years of the most difficult human living conditions that have ever existed. There is a way in which this reordering of the timeline changes how the whole story feels. If dogs had emerged from the agricultural period, the relationship could be understood as practical in origin, a useful arrangement that grew out of the material conditions of settled life. The evidence does not support that reading. Instead, it suggests something that is both simpler and harder to categorize: that humans and dogs needed each other, or chose each other, or simply could not stop choosing each other, under conditions where nothing was settled, nothing was certain, and every other arrangement of survival was temporary. The dog that traveled with nomadic humans across the Ice Age landscape was not a farmer's dog. It was something more fundamental than that. It was a companion in the oldest sense of the word, present during the most formative and most vulnerable period in all of human history, before the structures that we now use to define and protect ourselves had been built. Before humans had walls, they had dogs. Before they had locks, they had dogs. Before they had everything else, they had this. That history is still in the animal. It is in the way a dog positions itself between you and the door at night. It is in the instinct to check, when the house goes quiet, that everyone is still there. It is in the bones of a young dog, buried in the Rhine Valley 14,223 years ago, the record of a relationship that was already old by the time writing existed to record anything at all. The farms came later. The dog was already old news, long before the world had walls. And the animal that had traveled all that way with the people who built those walls had, during those thousands of years of shared nomadic life, been changing in ways that went far beyond the physical. Something had been developing in its mind, something specific and extraordinary that no other animal on Earth had developed in quite the same way. And the first glimpse of it comes when you watch a dog follow a pointed finger. One of the things that changed during domestication was almost invisible from the outside, and it only became visible at all when researchers started testing it systematically. Point at something, and a dog will look at where you are pointing. Not at your hand, not at your face, but at the object or direction your extended finger indicates. This sounds unremarkable until you try to understand how extraordinary it actually is. The ability to follow a pointing gesture requires the animal to understand that the gesture is communicative, that a finger extended in a specific direction is meant to convey information about something beyond itself, and that the appropriate response is to look in that direction rather than at the thing doing the pointing. This is a form of social cognition that most species do not have. Researchers have tested it extensively across dozens of animals. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, who share approximately 98% of our DNA and who demonstrate many sophisticated cognitive abilities, struggle to follow human pointing reliably. They can learn it with training, but it does not come to them the way it comes to dogs, as a spontaneous default response to a human gesture. Wolves, even wolves that have been raised by humans from birth, handled and socialized throughout their development, fed by human hands and integrated into human households, do not reliably follow pointing gestures either. The ability is not simply a product of exposure to humans. It does not appear in every animal that grows up around people. It is specific to dogs, and researchers believe it emerged through the domestication process itself. The best current explanation is that something happened in the dog lineage across the long period of close association with humans that shaped dogs specifically to pay attention to human communicative signals, not to human presence generally, and not to human behavior as a whole, but to the particular kind of signal that carries information about the world beyond the immediate interaction. A pointing finger is a piece of language. It says, "Look there, not here." The dog reads it as such. This is a form of joint attention, the ability to share a focus with another individual on something outside the interaction itself. And it is a cognitive capacity that plays a central role in how humans communicate and how human children learn language. Dogs also do something that researchers found even more striking when they first studied it carefully. When a dog encounters a problem it cannot solve on its own, a container it cannot open, a toy stuck out of reach, an obstacle it cannot navigate around, it does not simply persist or give up. It turns and looks at the human nearby. It makes deliberate eye contact. It alternates its gaze between the problem and the person, as if directing attention to the difficulty and waiting for the person to recognize it and help. Wolves do not do this. Hand-raised wolves, fully socialized to human presence, confronted with the same unsolvable problems in the same conditions, attempt to solve the problem independently. They do not turn to the humans nearby. They do not make eye contact in the expectation that a human's engagement will change the situation. The behavior is not present. In dogs, it is present, from puppyhood, without training, and it appears across breeds that have been geographically and genetically isolated from each other for thousands of years. It is not a learned trick. It is a built-in expectation, the product of many thousands of years of living alongside a species that was, in fact, frequently able to help when the dog indicated that help was needed. The looking back behavior is sometimes described by researchers as referential communication, which is a technical phrase for something that feels very familiar in everyday life. It is what a person does when they cannot reach something on a high shelf and they catch someone else's eye and glance up at it. It is what a child does when they want something they cannot get themselves and they turn to the nearest adult. It is a signal that crosses the boundary between two minds and says, "I need what you have." And the dog does it naturally, directed specifically at humans, in the calm assumption that the communication will be received. What this tells us is that the dog does not simply tolerate humans or live alongside them in a state of neutral coexistence. The dog expects humans to be cognitively present, to be agents capable of understanding what the dog is communicating and responding to it. It has built this expectation in at a level that shapes its behavior from the earliest weeks of life. The relationship is built into the animal at a depth that no amount of training placed there, because it preceded training by many thousands of years. The dog is not just watching the human, it is reading the human, actively and continuously, with the expectation that the human is someone worth reading. And part of what it is watching for, with particular intensity, is what happens when it looks the human directly in the eyes. The gaze turned out to have a biology. In 2015, a research team at Azabu University in Japan published a study in the journal Science that described something that had not previously been demonstrated between any two different species. The study, led by Miho Nagasawa, measured what happened in the bodies of dogs and their owners during a simple interaction. They were brought into a room together and allowed to interact freely, and the researchers tracked how long the dogs and their owners spent gazing into each other's eyes. At the beginning and end of each session, urine samples were collected from both the humans and the dogs. The samples were analyzed for oxytocin. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone, though that name undersells its complexity. It is a neurochemical involved in social attachment across many mammalian species, released during positive physical and emotional contact between individuals who are bonded to each other. Crucially, it operates as a feedback loop. When you look into the eyes of someone you are bonded to, oxytocin is released. That release reinforces the bond, making you more likely to look again, which releases more oxytocin, which deepens the attachment further. Researchers had identified this loop operating between human parents and their infants, and it is considered one of the primary biological mechanisms through which parent-child attachment forms in the early months of life. What Nagasawa's team found was that the same loop was operating between dogs and their owners. Dogs that spent more time gazing at their owners had higher oxytocin levels at the end of the session. Their owners had higher oxytocin levels too. The direction of effect mattered, specifically. It was the dog gazing at the human that drove the human's oxytocin rise. And the size of the effect correlated with the amount of mutual gazing. The more they looked at each other, the higher both parties' oxytocin levels climbed. To confirm that the gaze itself was driving the effect, rather than some other element of the interaction, the team then administered oxytocin nasally to a group of dogs before they interacted with their owners. Female dogs that received a placebo, and those owners' oxytocin levels rose in response to the increased gazing. The loop was confirmed. Gaze raises oxytocin in the human, which deepens the bond, which the dog responds to with more gazing, which raises oxytocin in the dog. The researchers also tested the same protocol with wolves. Hand-raised wolves, socialized to humans from birth and familiar with the handlers involved, were brought in for the same sessions. The wolves did not engage in extended mutual gazing with the humans, and neither the wolves nor their human handlers showed elevated oxytocin levels after the interaction. The oxytocin gaze loop, so clearly present between dogs and their owners, was essentially absent between wolves and theirs. This finding was remarkable because it identified not just a behavioral difference between dogs and wolves, but a physiological one. Dogs had, through the domestication process, acquired the biological capacity to trigger a bonding response in humans through eye contact. Researchers at Duke University who wrote a perspective on the study used the phrase that dogs had hijacked the human bonding pathway, turning the mechanism that evolved for the human parent-infant relationship into a tool for forming and maintaining bonds across species lines. The word hijacked sounds intentional, but the process was anything but. It was, like everything else in this story, the slow result of thousands of years of selection pressure pointing in the same direction, toward animals that connected with humans in increasingly deep and biological ways, and survived better because of it. The humans on the other side of that gaze were responding with the same chemistry they used to bond with their own children. Not metaphorically, literally, the same hormone, rising in the same way, in response to the same behavior, whether the face looking back at them belonged to another human or to a dog. This is the mechanism that sealed what the campfire started. The proximity and the food and the mutual utility built the first structure of the relationship. The gaze built the bond that lives inside it. Every time you look into a dog's eyes and feel something that is harder to explain than any practical arrangement should produce, this is the loop that is running. It has been running in both directions, between humans and dogs, for longer than any other cross-species bond in the history of life on Earth. The oxytocin loop is still running now, in every room where a human and a dog sit quietly together at the end of a long day. And the dog watching you from across that room is also, at this moment, reading you with something even older than the eyes. Before the gaze, before the pointing and the understanding and the oxytocin loop, there is something older, something that predates all of the cognitive and emotional architecture of the dog-human relationship and underlies all of it: the nose. A dog's sense of smell operates at a scale that the human brain genuinely struggles to comprehend, not because the numbers are large, but because they describe a qualitatively different way of experiencing reality. Dogs have approximately 300 million olfactory receptors in their noses. Humans have somewhere between 5 and 6 million. The part of the dog's brain dedicated to analyzing scent is roughly 40 times larger in proportion to overall brain size than the equivalent region in the human brain. Dogs can detect odors at concentrations measured in parts per trillion. To give that number some grounding, when humans begin to detect a scent, the concentration is typically measured in parts per million. The difference between those two figures is not a matter of degree, it is a difference in kind. What this means in practice is that a dog walking into a room you have recently left is not registering your absence. It is reading a detailed and layered record of your presence, including when you were there, roughly how long you stayed, what your emotional state was during your time in the room, what you had eaten, and whether your body chemistry indicated anything unusual in your health. A dog pausing to smell a patch of grass on a street is not doing something aimless or distracted. It is reading a complete record of every animal and person that has passed through that location, with information about their identity, their health, their stress level, and the approximate timeline of their passing, all of it encoded in chemical traces that the dog's nose processes simultaneously and with a precision that no instrument humans have built comes close to matching. Dogs can be trained to detect specific cancers through the scent of a person's breath or bodily fluids, And this is not a marginal or disputed capability. Studies in peer-reviewed journals have documented dogs identifying lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and ovarian cancer through scent detection with accuracy rates that compare favorably to clinical screening methods. They can detect the physiological changes that precede a dangerous drop in blood sugar in a diabetic person before the person themselves is aware anything is wrong. They can detect the specific cortisol compounds released in human sweat during emotional stress, which is why a dog so often appears at the side of a distressed person before that person has made any visible signal of distress. When two dogs meet and spend a long moment with their faces close to each other, they are exchanging more information about each other than a human could gather from an hour-long conversation. When a dog arrives in a new place and begins moving through it with its nose working, it is not exploring, it is reading. The environment, to a dog's nose, is a three-dimensional text written in time as well as space, a record of what has been there, what is still present in trace, and what the chemical signatures of those presences indicate about everything that matters. The relationship between dogs and humans has been built, in part, on this capability. The dogs at the edge of Paleolithic camps were not simply watching the humans nearby. They were reading them in a continuous chemical stream of information that the humans had no awareness of providing. They knew, through scent, when the humans were afraid, when they were calm, when they were healthy, when they were ill. They navigated the emotional landscape of the people around them through a channel that those people could not perceive or manage. Over thousands of generations of close cohabitation, this gave dogs an extraordinarily detailed model of what humans are, how they behave, what their physical states mean, and how to respond to the chemical signals that accompany each of those states. The dog that appears beside you when you are upset before you have said anything, or moved in any visible way, is not doing something mysterious. It is responding to information you did not know you were broadcasting, information written in the chemistry of your body and read by an animal that has been refining its ability to read that chemistry, in the context of humans specifically, for tens of thousands of years. Every scent that reaches a dog's nose arrives not as a single note, but as a full composition, layers of information arriving simultaneously, passed by a brain built specifically to extract meaning from precisely those kinds of complex chemical signals. The world as a dog's nose reads it is a richer, more layered, more temporally detailed place than any world a human nose will ever open. And alongside that nose, listening to a range of sound that extends far beyond anything your ears can reach, are two ears that can rotate independently to locate a source, controlled by 18 separate muscles, able to detect what is coming long before it arrives. Those 18 muscles do not work in unison. Each ear moves independently of the other, giving the dog a directional precision that no human anatomy is built to replicate. While you process sound with both ears pointed at the same source, a dog can point one ear at the noise near the window and the other at the movement in the hallway, gathering information from two directions at once and triangulating position with accuracy that requires no conscious effort. It is simply what those ears do. The frequency range those ears work with extends well beyond what human hearing can reach. Dogs detect sounds up to roughly 65,000 cycles per second. The human range tops out at around 20,000 cycles per second for most adults, and narrows further with age. Between those two numbers lies an entire range of sound information that arrives at the dog's ears continuously and never reaches yours at all. Dog whistles are calibrated to exactly this gap, producing a pitch that is genuinely inaudible to the humans holding them, while landing clearly within the dog's hearing as a fully perceivable, ordinary sound. The electronics in your home emit constant high-frequency signals in this range. You have never consciously heard them. The dog has registered them as part of the ambient texture of your house for as long as it has lived there. Dogs can also detect sounds from roughly 4 times the distance that human hearing allows. Whatever you would need to stand 20 feet from to hear, a dog can detect from approximately 80 feet. This is the simple mechanical explanation behind the behavior every dog owner recognizes: the sudden head lift, the shift in posture, the movement toward the door before anything visible has changed, the car turning into your street, the footsteps on the path outside. These are not anticipations or mysterious foreknowledge. The dog heard them before they entered your range. It is already current on information you are still waiting to receive. The evolutionary origin of this capability is specific. Wolves are not exclusively large prey hunters. They frequently prey on small animals, mice, voles, and rabbits, animals that communicate in high-pitched frequencies and whose movement through grass and leaf litter produces sounds in ranges that fall entirely above human hearing. The wolves that could detect those small prey sounds survived better, hunted more successfully, and raised more young. The dog inherited that high-frequency sensitivity across every breed, including ones that have never hunted anything in their lives. The same auditory equipment that a wolf uses to hear a mouse moving under snow is present in the bichon frisé on a sofa cushion. The ears also carry significant expressive function. Dogs communicate extensively through ear position and movement, and humans read that communication correctly and instinctively. Ears pressed flat signal fear or submission. Ears raised and directed forward signal alertness or interest. The sideways tilt that a dog produces when processing an unfamiliar sound is so universally recognized that people with no formal knowledge of animal behavior interpret it accurately on instinct. The ears are not only sensory instruments, they are part of the dog's emotional language, a channel of communication that developed in the specific context of the human-dog relationship, and that both species, across thousands of years, learned to read in each other. Puppies are born without access to any of it. Dogs enter the world with their ear canals sealed, completely deaf, navigating the first weeks of life through scent, touch, and warmth alone. Hearing does not develop until approximately 3 weeks of age, around day 21. What opens then is immediate and complete, a sensory world richer in several dimensions than the one their owners live in, delivered all at once to a very young animal that has spent 3 weeks learning to operate without it. The puppy that was deaf at 2 weeks is, at 3 weeks, already hearing frequencies you will never detect, from distances beyond your auditory reach, and is doing so without any training, because the capacity was always there, waiting for the canal to unseal. That sensory world is never switched off. When a dog sits quietly in a room that seems silent to you, it is not in silence. It is in a continuously updating acoustic landscape, full of information, arriving from sources and at frequencies that your hearing cannot access. The stillness of a calm dog in a quiet house is not the absence of experience. It is the experience of an animal processing far more than you are, from an environment far louder in certain registers than you will ever be able to hear, and finding nothing in that information right now that requires a response. The dog is always listening, and when the day finally finishes and the body settles towards sleep, it takes all of that with it into the dark. What happens inside a sleeping dog's mind? And what the dog's brain does with the world it has spent the entire day absorbing is a question that researchers have spent years working carefully toward an answer for. What they found is that the dog does exactly what you do when the night comes and the world goes quiet. It dreams. Dogs have REM sleep. This is established and not in scientific dispute. The same phase of sleep in which humans dream, characterized by rapid movement of the eyes beneath closed lids, irregular breathing, and elevated brain activity compared to other sleep stages, occurs in dogs as reliably as it occurs in people. During these periods, dogs show exactly the behavioral signs that humans show during REM sleep. The paws twitch. The breathing becomes shallow and uneven. The eyes move beneath the closed lids. Some dogs vocalize quietly, producing small sounds that have no apparent source in the waking environment. The body is still, but something inside it is busy. The question of what dogs are experiencing during these periods cannot be answered directly. For the same reason, it cannot be answered directly in humans. No one has access to another mind's internal experience. But the science of what happens neurologically during animal sleep has advanced considerably, and what it points toward is consistent enough to take seriously. In 2001, researchers Matthew Wilson and Kenway Louie at MIT published findings from a study in which they implanted electrodes in the brains of rats and recorded their neural activity while the animals ran mazes during the day. They then recorded the same neural activity while the rats slept that night. What they found was that during REM sleep, the rats' brains reproduced patterns of activity that closely matched the patterns recorded during the maze runs. The same sequences of neural firing that corresponded to specific locations and movements in the maze appeared again during sleep, in the same order and at roughly the same proportional timing. The rats were, in some functional sense, running the maze again while they slept. The relevance to dogs follows from what is known about comparative sleep neuroscience. Dogs have a brain structure similar to humans and rats in the regions associated with memory consolidation and emotional processing. There is no identified reason why the same process of REM-based experience replay that operates in rats would not operate in dogs, and substantial indirect evidence that it does. Harvard psychologist Deirdre Barrett, who has researched animal dreaming, has noted that given what we know about the function of REM sleep and the neural structures involved, the most reasonable hypothesis is that dogs dream about the experiences most emotionally significant to them during the day. For most dogs, those experiences involve the people they live with. The suggestion is not that dogs dream in the way that humans construct elaborate narrative dreams. It is simpler than that, and in some ways more affecting. The dog that went on a walk through a new neighborhood is likely processing those scents and sounds and movements during the night that follows. And the dog that spent a day close to its owner, in the ordinary proximity and interaction of shared domestic life, is, according to the best available evidence, probably experiencing some version of that closeness again while it sleeps. There is also a structural difference between small and large dogs in how they experience sleep that Stanley Coren, a psychologist and longtime researcher of canine cognition, has documented. Smaller dogs have shorter but more frequent REM cycles throughout a sleep period. Larger dogs enter fewer but longer REM phases. A small dog's night of sleep may include many brief episodes of the twitching, vocalizing, and eye movement that signal REM activity. A large dog's may include fewer, longer episodes. Both are dreaming. They are simply doing it at different rhythms. Dogs also shift their sleep to align with the humans around them. This is one of the more quietly telling aspects of the relationship. Dogs are not obligate nocturnal or diurnal animals. They are capable of sleeping at almost any hour, and they tend, across studies and across the ordinary experience of anyone who has lived with a dog, to structure their sleep around the schedule of the household. When the humans in the house are active, the dog is generally active. When the house settles into the particular stillness that belongs to the late evening, the dog settles too. The sleep of the dog and the sleep of the people it lives with are not independent events. They are loosely synchronized, two biological rhythms that have been overlapping for so long that they have learned to run on similar clocks. What the sleeping dog is doing, in the deepest reading of the evidence, is processing its day the same way you process yours. Consolidating experiences, strengthening the neural traces of what mattered. Returning, in whatever form the dreaming brain constructs, to the moments and the presences that registered as significant during the hours that preceded sleep. For a dog whose world is centered on the people it lives with, those moments are probably not hard to identify, and the person at the center of them is, most likely, you. The history that brought the dog to this place, to your house and your schedule and your particular rhythm of waking and sleeping, is a history that spans the globe and every human civilization that has ever existed. The next chapter is the evidence for that. As humans spread across the earth, the dog spread with them. And as the environments and demands of human life diversified across thousands of years and thousands of miles, something in the relationship between humans and dogs diversified too, not in its emotional foundation, which remained what it had always been, but in the practical shape it took. Different people in different conditions needed different things from dogs, and dogs, with the same deep attention to human behavior that had been building across tens of thousands of years, were capable of being shaped to provide them. The earliest working roles were probably extensions of what had already been happening naturally. A dog living near a human camp that barked at approaching predators or unfamiliar sounds was already performing a guarding function, whether anyone had asked it to or not. A dog with strong instincts for chasing and following scent, tolerated by hunters because it reliably flushed game or tracked wounded animals, was already working as a hunting companion before anyone had formalized the idea of a working dog. The roles preceded the deliberate selection for them. Humans noticed what certain dogs were already inclined to do, and began, gradually and with increasing intention, to breed for those inclinations. Herding dogs emerged in the context of pastoral cultures, communities that kept livestock and needed to manage the movement of large numbers of sheep or cattle across terrain too wide for a single person to oversee. The border collie and its relatives carry a behavioral complex that includes a modified predatory stalk, the capacity to hold the gaze of a sheep and control its movement without contact, and an extraordinary responsiveness to human direction at great distances. This behavioral suite did not exist in the original wolf. It was built through selection over many generations, from the raw material of the dog's predatory instincts, redirected and refined for a purpose those instincts were never originally designed to serve. Sled dogs in the Arctic represent a different kind of extreme. Breeds like the Siberian Husky and the Alaskan Malamute were shaped to work in conditions that would kill most animals. Temperatures that can fall to 70 degrees below zero, pulling loads across ice and snow for hours without stopping. Their coats, their physiology, their endurance capacity, and their willingness to work in coordinated teams were all selected for across many generations in populations that would not have survived the Arctic without these animals. The relationship in these cultures was one of complete mutual dependence, and the dogs bred for it reflect that dependence in every aspect of their physical and behavioral makeup. The list of working contexts is long and it continues to grow. Dogs served as messengers in ancient warfare, carrying communications across battlefields where no human runner could safely travel. They worked in mines, pulling carts of ore through tunnels too narrow for horses. They guarded flocks from wolves, lions, and bears, in cultures ranging from Central Asia to the Pyrenees to the mountains of Anatolia. They hunted by sight on open plains, by scent through dense forest, by sound in packs pursuing game across terrain that varied from jungle to Arctic tundra. The modern working roles are different in their specifics, but continuous with everything that preceded them. A dog trained to detect non-small cell lung cancer in a patient's breath sample is doing something that would have been incomprehensible to the people at the Bonn Oberkassel burial site, but it is doing it through exactly the same biological equipment, the same 300 million olfactory receptors, the same extraordinary sensitivity to minute chemical changes that those people's dog already possessed 14,000 years ago. A guide dog navigating a busy street with a visually impaired person is exercising the same deep attentiveness to human need and the same responsiveness to human direction that every dog in this history has always brought to its relationship with people. A search and rescue dog locating a survivor under rubble is using the scent tracking that its ancestor used to follow game across a Pleistocene landscape. What all of these roles share, across every culture and every era and every specific task, is a dog that is paying extremely close attention to a human. The foundation has never changed. The attention that began at the edge of a campfire, the particular quality of focus that dogs bring to the people around them, is present in every working context dogs have ever occupied. It is the substrate beneath every skill. No amount of specialized training produces a working dog without it, and every working dog that has ever succeeded has had it as a given, before any training began. The dog is always, first, watching you. Everything else follows from that. The watching traveled everywhere humans went, on every migration route and trade road and sea crossing that spread human civilization across the surface of the world, until there was no inhabited place left where a dog was not already there. Dogs did not stay where they started. The genetic record is clear on this. Studies of DNA from ancient dog remains and modern dog populations across the world have established that dogs accompanied human migrations as people spread out from their original population centers and moved into new territories. They crossed the land bridge from Asia into the Americas, alongside the first humans to make that crossing. They traveled with the early populations that moved into Australia. They were present in the settlements that became ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. Wherever the archaeological record contains evidence of human presence, it contains, nearby, evidence of dogs. In Europe, cave paintings that date to the late Paleolithic period include images of animals running alongside human hunters in configurations that researchers interpret as depicting hunting partnerships rather than prey. The dogs in these images are not being hunted. They are running with the hunters, in a formation that would be recognizable as cooperative pursuit to anyone who has watched a working dog alongside a hunter in any modern context. The paintings are roughly contemporaneous with the Bonn Oberkassel burial and suggest that by this period, the practical working relationship between humans and dogs was already well established across a wide geographic range. In ancient Egypt, dogs were named. This is a detail worth pausing on. The act of giving an individual animal a name represents a specific kind of relationship with it, one in which the animal is recognized as a particular being rather than simply a representative of its type. Egyptian tomb inscriptions include the names of dogs, and the dogs named were sometimes buried within the tomb itself, alongside the person they had belonged to, with the same care given to human burials. The names recorded include things that translate roughly as Blackie, good herdsman, and reliable. They are practical names, the names of animals that were known as individuals, that were lived with and depended upon, and that were thought worth commemorating in stone. In ancient China, dog bones appear at Neolithic sites dating to more than 7,000 years ago. In refuse heaps, but also in burial contexts, dogs interred with humans in a pattern consistent with the burial practices found at sites across Europe and the Near East from the same general period. The consistency of this practice across cultures that had no contact with each other is one of the most striking aspects of the archaeological record. People across the entire inhabited world, working from completely different cultural frameworks and facing completely different environmental conditions, independently arrived at the same response to the death of a dog. They buried it as something that mattered. Indigenous cultures across the Americas had dogs before European contact, and genetic studies confirm those dogs descended from the animals that crossed from Asia with the first human migrants, not from any separate domestication event in the Americas. The relationship crossed an ocean's worth of distance and an ice age's worth of hardship, with the people who carried it and arrived, apparently intact, on a new continent, where it continued across thousands of years of North and South American human history, in forms ranging from working partners in hunting and transport to companions kept close in domestic life. There is no inhabited continent that lacks a record of dogs in the deep human past. There is no culture with a historical record in which dogs are absent. The relationship appears in Norse mythology, in Greek mythology, in the mythology of cultures across West Africa, across Mesoamerica, across the Pacific Islands. Dogs appear in the oldest written literature that has survived, in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus's dog Argos, who has waited 20 years for his master's return, recognizes him immediately on his homecoming and dies contentedly, having seen him one final time. That story is approximately 2,800 years old, and it is completely legible. Every element of it, the loyalty, the recognition, the waiting, is recognizable to any person who has ever had a dog. What all of this distribution tells us is that the bond formed in the Ice Age was not a local phenomenon that spread through cultural transmission, like a technique for making tools or a method for preserving food. It was something that reformed, independently and reliably, wherever humans and dogs were in proximity. The relationship did not need to be taught. It persisted because it was already built into both species, the human tendency to bond with the dog that paid attention to it, and the dog's deep inclination to pay that attention, and these two things together produced the same outcome in every human context they encountered. The diversity of what humans eventually made of that relationship, the extraordinary range of forms and functions the dog took on across different cultures and environments, is the next part of this story, and it begins with a question that sounds simple but isn't. How did one animal become 400 different things without ever stopping being itself? Every breed of dog alive today is the same animal. A Chihuahua and an Irish Wolfhound are the same species. They share the same ancestor, the same basic genome, the same capacity to follow a pointed finger, the same oxytocin response to mutual gazing with a human, the same REM sleep, the same scent processing anatomy. One weighs 2 kilograms and one weighs close to 60. They are, biologically, the same creature, shaped differently by the different pressures applied across generations of human selection in different places and for different purposes. The range of body size variation within dogs is greater than in any other mammal species. No other animal on Earth shows the degree of size and shape diversity within a single species that dogs display. This is entirely a product of human selection, of people in different environments with different needs choosing to breed for different traits across many generations, and it happened with a speed in biological terms that is almost without precedent. The most dramatic acceleration of breed differentiation occurred in the last 200 years, particularly in the Victorian era in Britain, when kennel clubs began formalizing breed standards and systematic selective breeding became an organized cultural practice rather than an informal regional one. The sheer variety visible in any dog show today is, in evolutionary terms, extraordinarily recent. Before the Victorian formalization, the diversity of dogs was already real, but shaped by function rather than appearance. Dogs in different environments and cultures diverged because different tasks required different bodies. The greyhound's extreme lean length and deep chest developed in open landscapes where speed over distance was the primary requirement. The basset hound's low center of gravity and long ears, which help direct scent toward the nose, developed in dense undergrowth where tracking close to the ground was what the work demanded. The Newfoundland's dense waterproof coat and webbed feet developed in cold Atlantic fishing communities, where a dog that could swim in near-freezing water and assist in water rescue was the animal the environment required. Every distinctive physical feature in every breed is the answer to a question that a specific human context, in a specific place and time, was asking. What is remarkable is how much remained constant through all of this diversification. The behavioral and cognitive traits that define dogs as dogs, the attentiveness to humans, the ability to read human gestures and emotional states, the capacity for the interspecies bonding loop, the inclination to seek human company and to adjust behavior based on human signals. All of these survived unchanged across thousands of years of selection that was reshaping every physical attribute simultaneously. Humans were selecting for size, coat, speed, temperament, nose acuity, and dozens of other specific traits, and in doing so, were producing radically different-looking animals. But none of that selection dismantled the fundamental cognitive and emotional architecture that makes a dog in relation to a human. The smallest toy breeds and the largest working breeds are equally capable of understanding that a pointed finger is a piece of communication rather than simply a thing in space. A dachshund selected for small body and low ground tracking can engage in the same gaze-mediated oxytocin loop with its owner as a Saint Bernard selected for mountain rescue in the Alps. The Pomeranian and the Akita and the Australian cattle dog are physically almost incomparable. Their relationship with human attention is identical. This consistency suggests that the traits underlying the human-dog bond are deeply conserved, meaning they are coded in ways that ordinary selective breeding does not easily break. They appear to be part of the dog's fundamental architecture, in a way that surface features like coat length and muzzle shape are not. You can breed a dog that looks nothing like any dog that has existed before. You will still get an animal that watches your face, follows your gestures, and seeks your proximity. The diversity of the dog is, in this reading, a testament to how much humans have been able to extract from one relationship without breaking what made the relationship worth having in the first place. 400 different physical expressions in environments ranging from the Sahara to the Arctic, performing roles from truffle hunting to military service to lap companion, and underneath all of it, the same animal, still watching the same face, still reading the same gestures, still expecting that the attention it gives will be returned. That expectation is well-founded, and what the dog is specifically reading in the human face it watches so closely is something that researchers have now measured in enough detail to be specific about. The dog knows when you are not all right, and it knows before you have said so. How it knows this, and the specific mechanisms behind the reading it is doing of your face and your body at any given moment, is the subject of a body of research that has been building for the last 2 decades, and that keeps producing findings more precise than the researchers expected to find. A dog knows when you are sad, not because it has been told, not because you have explained it, but because it reads you continuously and in detail, and the information it gathers is specific enough to tell it something is different from how it usually is. The evidence for this is no longer anecdotal. Researchers have been studying canine emotional perception systematically for long enough now that the findings form a consistent picture, and that picture is one of an animal that pays closer attention to human emotional states than almost any other species that shares human domestic space. Dogs can distinguish between photographs of happy and angry human faces. This was established in controlled studies in which dogs were shown images of the same person in 2 different emotional expressions and trained to touch one with their nose. Once they learned to reliably indicate the happy or angry face in training images, they were shown new faces they had never seen before, including faces belonging to a different species than they had trained on. They generalized the distinction accurately, demonstrating that what they were reading was genuine emotional expression rather than a memorized image. What is particularly specific is where dogs look on a human face when they are assessing emotional content. Dogs show what researchers call a left gaze bias when looking at human faces, meaning they preferentially examine the right side of the human face from the dog's perspective, which corresponds to the left side of the face from the human's perspective. This matters because the left side of the human face tends to be more emotionally expressive, a reflection of the right hemisphere of the brain's dominant role in emotional processing. The left gaze bias in dogs, when reading human faces, is not found in dogs looking at objects, or at other dogs, or at most other animals. It appears specifically when the dog is looking at a human face, and it appears to be the strategy the dog has developed for extracting maximum emotional information from the available signal. Dogs also show what researchers call emotional contagion with the people around them. They become distressed when their owners are distressed. Studies measuring cortisol levels in dogs have found that a stressed owner is typically accompanied by a stressed dog, and that this relationship persists even when the owner's stress is not being expressed in any overt behavioral way. The dog is picking up on something the owner may not even be aware they are broadcasting. The subtle physiological signals, the small changes in scent, in muscle tension, in breathing pattern and vocal pitch, that the dog's integrated sensory picture of you produces. Research has also found that dogs preferentially approach people who are crying over people who are humming quietly or talking normally, and they approach in a characteristic way, offering bodily contact, making themselves available rather than seeking attention, as if orienting toward the distress rather than away from it. This is not behavior that needs to be trained. It appears in dogs without specific training in emotional support contexts, suggesting it is part of the dog's default behavioral repertoire when in the presence of human distress signals. There is also evidence that dogs yawn in response to human yawning more readily than they do in response to other dogs yawning, and that this contagious yawning is more pronounced with familiar humans than with strangers. Contagious yawning is a behavior that researchers associate with empathic capacity in mammals, the tendency to mirror the physiological states of others as part of a broader social synchronization with the individuals around you. Dogs do it most readily with the people they are bonded to. None of this is training. None of it is a trick the dog has been taught. It is the output of tens of thousands of years of an animal being shaped consistently and under real selection pressure to pay attention to how the humans near it are doing, and to respond to that information with behavior that brought the human and the dog closer together. The dogs that could read human emotion accurately and respond to it appropriately were the dogs that maintained the bond. The bond maintained them. The two things reinforced each other across every generation of the relationship. The dog that appears beside you in a quiet moment, that settles close and stays there without being asked, is not performing a learned behavior. It is being exactly what it was shaped over millennia to be. An animal that noticed you needed something and moved toward you before you asked. What that movement does to your body, measurably and verifiably, is what the next chapter is about. Because the comfort you feel when a dog settles against you is not a soft or indeterminate thing. It is a physiological event, documented in cortisol readings and blood pressure measurements and heart rate data, with a precision that makes it one of the most thoroughly quantified aspects of the human-dog relationship in all of the research literature. The body responds, not because it decides to, not through any conscious effort on your part, but because the biology of the human-dog bond is not confined to the emotional or the cognitive. It runs all the way down into the physiology, into the measurable chemistry of the body, and it changes that chemistry in directions that are by now consistent across enough independent studies to constitute a genuine scientific finding. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone in the human body. What studies measuring cortisol levels in people before and after interacting with dogs have consistently found is that interaction with a dog, including simply petting one, reduces cortisol. The effect is not small, and it is not dependent on the person being a dog owner or having a prior relationship with the specific animal. People who interact with unfamiliar dogs in controlled study settings show the same cortisol reduction as people interacting with their own dogs. The body responds to the dog's presence as a signal that the threat level has dropped, even when no threat was consciously perceived. Blood pressure and heart rate follow a similar pattern. Studies across a range of populations, including elderly adults, children undergoing medical procedures, and people in high-stress occupational environments, have found that the presence of a dog and physical contact with a dog lower both blood pressure and heart rate measurably, and within minutes of the interaction beginning. Hospital programs that bring therapy dogs to patients recovering from surgery or undergoing treatment report significant reductions in reported pain levels, alongside the measurable reductions in physiological stress markers. The effect is not subtle enough to dismiss as noise. It shows up consistently across different designs, different populations, and different measurement approaches. What is particularly significant about all of this research is that the effect is not placebo in the straightforward sense of being attributable to expectation or belief. The cortisol and blood pressure changes occur in the body's chemistry at a level that is not subject to conscious control. You cannot decide to lower your cortisol level. You cannot choose to slow your heart rate through an act of will. The dog's presence does something that reaches below the layer of conscious experience and changes the body's automatic functioning. Whatever the mechanism, it is not purely psychological. The effect is also bidirectional. The same kinds of physiological changes that occur in humans during positive interaction with dogs occur in the dogs during the same interaction. Dogs interacting with their owners in positive contexts show reduced cortisol levels and lowered heart rates. The calming runs in both directions simultaneously, two nervous systems settling together into a state that neither would reach as quickly alone. This bidirectionality is consistent with what the evolutionary history of the relationship would predict. If tens of thousands of years of coevolution shaped dogs to respond to human emotional states, and humans to respond to the dog's presence, then the physiological calming that characterizes the positive human-dog interaction is not a side effect. It is the relationship itself, expressed at the level of body chemistry. The bond is not only felt, it is measurable. This finding appears across multiple large-scale studies and holds across different cultural contexts. The mechanism is likely multifactorial, involving the physical calming effects already described, the social and emotional dimensions of the bond, and the behavioral effects of regular care and responsibility for another living creature. All of these run together in practice. And they run together because the relationship is not one thing, but a whole system of interconnected effects that support each other. It is providing something measurable and real, the breathing that slows and the shoulders that drop, and the particular quality of ease that comes when a warm, familiar animal settles against you, are not imagined. They are the physiological output of a bond that is 10,000 or 20,000 or 40,000 years old, and that has been shaped for exactly this, the two of you, quiet together, in the dark, at the end of a long day. That arrangement, the animal and the person in the same space at the same time of night, is as old as anything in human experience, and it has always looked like this. Dogs sleep near us. Across every culture and every era for which there is a record, this is what the relationship has always included: the dog, at night, somewhere close. The practice is not a modern domestication of a previously outdoor animal, although it is often framed that way. It is one of the oldest documented aspects of the human-dog relationship. The archaeological evidence from Paleolithic burials, including the one at Bonn Oberkassel, places dogs in close proximity to the people they belonged to in death, which strongly implies they were in close proximity to those same people in life. In indigenous cultures across the Americas, sleeping near dogs was documented by early European observers as universal practice, so common that it required no comment beyond a note of its existence. The phrase describing the coldest nights, as nights requiring multiple warm bodies for survival, is found in various forms across cultures in cold climates, from Siberia to Scandinavia to the Arctic, and the warm bodies in question were, consistently, dogs. Dogs also arrange their sleep around ours. They are not obligate nocturnal animals, not obligate diurnal animals, but animals capable of sleeping across a broad range of schedules, and what they consistently do, across breed and individual temperament, is synchronize their resting periods to the household. When the people in the house are active, the dog is generally active. When the house settles into the quiet that belongs to the late evening, the dog settles with it. This is not a behavior that owners typically teach. It emerges naturally from the dog's extraordinary attentiveness to human rhythms, the same attentiveness that allowed dogs to integrate into human social life in the first place, expressed now in the specific context of when it is time to be awake and when it is time to rest. Studies that have measured the sleep quality of people who sleep in the same room as a dog have produced nuanced results. Human sleep efficiency, the proportion of time in bed actually spent in sleep rather than waking, is modestly lower on average for people whose dogs sleep in the bed with them than for people whose dogs sleep nearby but not in the bed. But the same studies found that people reported feeling a greater sense of security with the dog present, and that the feeling of security was associated with better subjective sleep quality even when objective efficiency measures were slightly reduced. The body feels safer. The body that feels safe sleeps differently than the body that does not. This particular benefit of the dog's presence at night is also ancient. In a world without locks or walls or any of the security infrastructure that modern life provides, sleeping near an animal with superior hearing, superior scent detection, and an alarm response calibrated to exactly the kinds of threats that were real for hunter-gatherers was a genuine and practical advantage. The nervous system's response to the dog's presence at night, the easing of vigilance, the loosening of the particular alertness that the dark tends to produce in a body operating on older programming, is a response that was adaptive for most of human history. You feel safer with the dog nearby because the dog made you safer for tens of thousands of years before safety became something you could purchase in other forms. All of this, the ancient practice and the modern study of it, the physiology and the history and the quiet daily fact of the dog finding its place near you as the night comes in, is the last image in a very long story. It began with a wolf pausing at the edge of a small fire in a frozen landscape so far back in time that it predates every written word, every city, every field, every wall. It continued through a young dog buried with two people in the Rhine Valley 14,000 years ago. Through the pointing finger followed, the gaze that raised oxytocin in two species simultaneously, the nose with 300 million receptors, the ears with 18 muscles rotating toward the dark, the dream that replays the day just lived. All of it leads here, to the foot of the bed, to the familiar weight of a sleeping animal, to the sense that the house is as it should be, that the perimeter is held, that the night is a normal night and not a danger, that everything necessary is present. The dog knows this. It is lying still, and its breathing is slow, and it is, by every measure, available to the science of sleep, and the science of bonding, and the long accumulated record of a relationship that is older than anything else humans have built, exactly where it belongs. The last chapter is not really an ending. It is just the place in the story where the fire comes back into view. The fire has not gone out. It is smaller now, and in a different form, but the same basic arrangement is still in place. A source of warmth in the dark, a human in proximity to it, and somewhere near that human, a dog. The story that arrived here traveled a long way to get to this point. It started with an extinct wolf, a species that no longer exists in any living form, whose lineage split somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, with one branch remaining wild and one branch slowly bending towards something new. It passed through the long Pleistocene winter, where hunter-gatherers without permanent homes found that certain wolves, slightly less fearful than the rest, kept appearing at the margin of the fire. It moved through the gradual physical softening of those wolves across many generations, the shortening of the muzzle and the rounding of the face, and the slow movement of a wild animal towards something that fit more easily inside the circle of human life. It reached the burial at Bonn Oberkassel, 14,223 years ago, where a young dog sick enough to have required weeks of human nursing, sick enough that its survival was impossible without deliberate care, was laid in the earth alongside two people with grave goods and pigment and everything else the culture of those people used to mark the passage of something worth marking. That burial is not a curiosity. It is the record of a love that existed before anyone had language precise enough to name it. It moved through the cognitive changes that domestication built into the dog over tens of thousands of years. The spontaneous following of a pointed finger. The referential gaze back at the human when the problem is unsolvable alone. The oxytocin loop that runs in both directions when a dog and a person look into each other's eyes. The same chemical cascade that bonds a mother to her infant, operating now across the boundary of species. The nose with 300 million receptors reading the world as a layered record across time. The ears with 18 muscles listening into frequencies the human auditory system will never reach. The REM sleep in which the dog replays the day just lived, and in which the experiences most likely being replayed are the ones that involve the people it belongs to. It traveled through the working roles that humans discovered across every inhabited environment on Earth. The herding dog, and the sled dog, and the hunting dog, and the guide dog, and the therapy dog, and the animal that can smell a cancer the instruments have not yet found. Through the ancient Egyptian tombs that named their dogs in stone. Through the Odyssey's faithful Argos, waiting 20 years. Through 400 breeds on every continent, each one a different physical answer to a different question. But every one of them, underneath the coat and the size and the task, the same animal, watching the same face. It arrived at the measurable biology of the bond. The cortisol that drops, the blood pressure that follows, the heart rate that slows, the nervous system that reads the dog's presence as a signal that the perimeter is held and the vigilance can ease, and the particular alertness that belongs to the dark is, for now, not required. And it arrived here, finally, at the dog sleeping near you, at the weight and the warmth and the breathing that is not yours. The second rhythm in the quiet room, the evidence that you are not alone in the dark, and that you have not been, not really, since something very old and very persistent decided to stay near the fire rather than run from it. This is what the story was moving toward. Not a conclusion, because the relationship has no conclusion that has yet been written. It continues in every house where a dog adjusts its sleep to match the schedule of the people around it. In every veterinary waiting room where someone refuses to leave. In every ordinary evening where a dog appears at someone's side before the person has found the words to say what they are feeling. If this channel has given you a way to carry the night, that is what it is here for. There are more stories where this one came from, more long, quiet journeys through the things that are worth knowing and worth resting inside. We will be here when the dark finds you again. The wolf paused at the edge of the fire. It decided to stay. That decision is still running, without interruption, all the way to this moment and this night, and the animal already somewhere close, breathing slowly, settling in, having made the same decision as its ancestor, without knowing what it means, and making it anyway.